Hello. I wanted to do a quick little video on genetic signatures and some information about phylogeography in the context of responses to climate change. So I wanted to give you an example. So biogeography, you might have heard of. Biogeography is the branch of biology that deals with the geographic distribution of plants and animals. So where things live compared to where one species lives compared to another. Maybe you're comparing, for example, here, monkeys. So we think of the splitting of Pangea, and there were old world monkeys and those that lived in the Eastern Hemisphere. And then New World monkeys, biologists refer to as those that live in the Western Hemisphere. So it's believed approximately 40 million years ago, there was this split among the monkeys in the world. And they have different characteristics. So old world monkeys have narrow noses, a thin septum, downward facing nostrils, like apes and humans. And New World monkeys have broad noses with a wider septum that separates. They also, so then there's a little table that I have here in terms of where the origin is. So Old World monkeys are originating in Africa and Asia, New World in the Americas. The body size of New World monkeys is a little smaller. I talked about the nose. The tail, the prehensile tail is in New World monkeys. So that's when they can hold on to a branch or something with that tail. Teeth are different. New World monkeys have more teeth, more premolars. Hands are different, ears, habitat. Mostly New World monkeys have are arboreal. They live in trees. There's a tendency for single female and multi-male social groups. And then in terms of old and New World monkeys, their infant care is a little different and their diet's a little different. So this is, studying where they are and looking at fossilized records of maybe this, one group of animals. And there's biologists who do this with every, group of everything from jellyfish to complicated trees. For monkeys, the primitive precursor species, the molecular clock estimates now date to the last common ancestor for Old and New World monkeys at a time about 100 million years after the continents, after Pangea started to split. And if you look in the literature, there's lots of different theories, and then fossils that are found and theories change. So it's a really interesting field. New World monkeys began the process of migrating to South America. They may have floated there, is one of the theories, on like vegetation rafts out of, various forms of trees, roots, kind of shoots. Giving that high level of intelligence of these animals, there could have been a lot of ways, a lot of things they did to cross the Atlantic. It could have been a really huge storm that pushed them. It could have also been, volcanic island chains that were linking Africa and South America. There was a research team led out of the National University of La Plata in Buenos Aires, Argentina, that found some monkey teeth while digging in the Peruvian Amazon. And one of the teeth that they found was very similar to a fossil tooth from Africa. So this is a field that's always changing and interesting to look at, and this is just one example. And there's differences, like you can see here. Old World monkeys also only can see in black and white, and New World monkeys can see in color. And that's believed to be a genetic mutation over time that's allowed for this change. So All right, so that is an example of biogeography. You also get into some concepts when you're studying biogeography about island hopping, and island biogeography is kind of its own field. So that's also looking at tectonics and earth science. So that's kind of the basics of biogeography. If we go to phylogenetics, that's the study of phylogeny. So the evolutionary history of taxonomic groups. So that's how they're related, their relation over time, what is a common ancestor, what is not a common ancestor, that kind of thing. Then this chapter that we've been reading talked about phylogeography. So that is the study of the historical processes that may be responsible for the contemporary geographic distribution of individuals. So to look at this, you have to consider geographic distributions of individuals in light of genetics, particularly population genetics. So you're looking at the historic processes and thinking about how that might have caused contemporary distributions. So I just wrote it down on the right of this slide here. So phylogeography is really looking at population genetics and systematics. So you're looking at genetic variation. So that's frequency of genes and alleles in a population over time and space. And you're using systematics, this classifying evolutionary history and relationships with that population genetics over time. So it's like a hypothetical framework to test the processes, looking at diversification. So in climate science, you're using this to see how species have changed over time. And it's something that we use a lot when we're thinking of responses to climate change, this concept of phylogeography. It's this framework to test the processes underlying diversification and how biodiversity is generated, maintained, how it changes over time. So phylogeography covers ecology and evolution, and there's a lot of stories in the text about phylogeography. And you think of things as like species dispersal or their ranges. Those are some concepts that we think of with phylogeography. And some of you asked, how's that different than landscape genetics? So landscape genetics is really looking at landscape ecology and population genetics. So landscape ecology is really the patterns, the interactions between ecosystems. So it's a subdiscipline of ecology, and it recognizes disturbance, what disturbance does. So this is why we talk about landscape genetics when we're talking about a climate change disturbance. And there are things that you think of like spatial heterogeneity, and new tools have allowed for more information to be assessed. So like GIS, imaging, mapping, satellite data, and some of the terms we use in landscape genetics is like patches or the matrix, which is, what's the overall kind of habitat that you're looking at. And then we think of fragmentation, and there's work on corridors. So that's kind of this idea of landscape ecology. How does the landscape and the pattern of the ecosystem change the species? Let's see. So really, in like the 90s is when phylogeography and landscape genetics kind of came about and started differentiating. They're both interdisciplinary fields. Here's two references, by the way, that you could look up to read more about them. Amanda Nelson and Leslie Reisler. So they're both interdisciplinary fields that combine molecular, genetic, and geographical data to understand evolutionary and ecological mechanisms that drive spatial distributions of biodiversity. So totally key to looking at response to climate change. And they overlap conceptually and in their application of geospatial and genetic tools. They differ in their spatial and temporal scales of focus. So phylogeographers investigate genetic signatures of geographical contexts that are deep in time. So that's where we can see the really long, big scale changes over time and broad in the spatial context, versus a landscape geneticist might focus on contemporary geographical contexts, land use change, at finer spatial scales. So the two fields lie at the nexus of this rapid advancement in biomolecular and geographic information science technologies. So they both provide challenges and opportunities for advancing interdisciplinary synthesis in biogeography. So the best kind of diagram or visual is still that I've been able to find in trying to prep a little talk on this is still figure 6.1 on page 68 on biodiversity and climate change by Lovejoy and Hannah. So it really you can see the spatial scale and the organismal scale for landscape genetics and phylogeography. And the terminology is very similar between. So Reisler summarizes in a text, a chapter of a text, that phylogeography is said to be the bridge between population genetics and systematics. And landscape genetics is the bridge between landscape ecology and population genetics. So both fields can be considered as simply the amalgamation of classic biogeography with genetics and genomics. They differ in the temporal, spatial, and organismal scales used to address the question that you're asking. So I hope that helps. There's a lot more I could say, but I think I'll end there, and I hope that helps. Thanks.